economics can be part of the solution. All too often, it's not. Wars can end broadly in either of two ways, either in a negotiated settlement or in a winner-take-all outcome. The advantages of negotiated settlements are, first of all, that it ends the violence sooner and therefore avoids the costs of perpetuating a longer war. They reduce the risk of contagion, of spillover from the conflict, in particular into neighboring countries. A negotiated settlement can reduce the risk that simmering grievances left behind in a winner-take-all victory will keep burning like embers under the society's surface and at some point reignite a new civil war. Now, I want to start out by discussing three sets of issues. The first is the role of economics in maintaining balances of power. The second are the whole set of distributional issues that arise in a post-conflict setting. And finally, I want to discuss the economics of state building. In the case of a negotiated settlement where neither side has got everything it wants, where they've agreed to a peace accord, which sets out some sort of a blueprint for building a sustainable peace in following years, one of the key issues is the balance of power between the two sides and within each side. Between the two sides, the balance is important so that neither side, if the balance tips too far in its favor, is tempted to resume the conflict in order to finish off their opponents, nor, if the balance is tipped too far against them, tempted to resume the war in order to defend their share of governance, resources, etc. And within warring parties, there's very often not unanimity as to whether to pursue a negotiated settlement. There are divisions between those within the warring parties who are amenable to a negotiated settlement, even though it doesn't fulfill their maximalist agenda of totally defeating the other side, versus those who want to keep pursuing the conflict, who are sometimes called hardliners, or in the context of a peace settlement, they're sometimes called spoilers. The toolkits at the disposal of the so-called international community, by which I mean not only the United Nations, but the multilateral development banks, the bilateral aid agencies, and so on, include diplomatic pressures, sanctions on countries and individuals, military interventions like the UN's peacekeepers, also known as blue helmets, and external assistance with the associated conditions. And because we're focusing here on the economic side of the scale, I'll pay particular attention to external assistance. The balances of power between warring parties was very much an issue, for example, in El Salvador. At the conclusion of that conflict, the result was not shared power. The US-backed government remained in power, but a pathway was opened up for the restoration of democratic rule, and the FMLN, the Opposition Guerrilla Alliance, became a legitimate political party, and indeed, ultimately down the road, became the main player in government for some time. Maintaining the balance between those two sides was an important issue because at the 11th hour of the peace negotiations here in New York between the government and the FMLN, the default setting for the provision of a lot of external assistance from official entities like the multilateral banks and the bilateral agencies is to channel that money through the government. The government is on the receiving end of that money. There's a very great risk that those resources will be monopolized and distributed in a way to provide political patronage to its supporters while excluding its erstwhile opponents. And faced with that, a mechanism was created by which international donors, the so-called like-minded group of bilateral donors, a number of European countries, for example, the Scandinavian countries, were able to channel their external resources, not through the government, but through a fund set up and managed by the UNDP, which would concentrate on reconstruction and development programs in the areas that had been controlled by the guerrillas, by the FMLN, and in the communities that had supported them. So that was an example, that mechanism of an effort to maintain the balance of power between warring parties in the wake of a civil war. And the UNDP, I have to say, did some marvelous work in that respect. I remember once going back to El Salvador a few years after our project had ended. I went to a big meeting near a district town called Chalatenango in the north. It was the occasion of celebrating the completion of a road building project funded on the precondition that both the FMLN side and the government side would collaborate in the implementation of the project, in designing and building the road. And a celebration was being held for its completion with music and kids singing songs and so on. And I remember at one point, the erstwhile leader of the local guerrillas and the erstwhile leader of the local military garrison both appeared together on stage and embraced each other and talked about how the conflict was over and now we are all Salvadoreños and we're working together. And that's an example of using reconstruction, using post-conflict external assistance as an instrument for forging a durable and lasting peace. But it takes a deliberate effort to do that. That doesn't just happen automatically. In fact, instead of helping to extinguish the embers of conflict, aid that's delivered without careful attention to these balances of power can be more like pouring new fuel onto the fire and risking reigniting that conflict. I'll give you one more example, this time in the case of balances of power within different parties to a conflict. And this comes from Bosnia in the former Yugoslavia, where at the conclusion of the war, many localities were predominantly under the control of one side or another. Before the war, these had very often been highly mixed communities with substantial representation, proportions in their population of the three different sides to that conflict, who were called the Bosnian Serbs, the Bosnian Croats, and the Bosniaks, sometimes called the Bosnian Muslims. After the war and the ethnic cleansing operations that took place during the war, the United Nations High Commission of Refugees, the responsibilities of which included trying to facilitate the return of refugees and of internally displaced persons to their former homes, decided that in order to facilitate that process, they would provide resources to municipal governments that would be used for reconstruction, resettlement, schools, infrastructure, etc. But they decided to make that assistance conditional on the municipality itself taking steps to welcome refugees. And they tailored those conditions to the local circumstances. So in one municipality, it might be taking down hate propaganda that was pasted all over the walls of the city. In another, it might be ensuring that people were able to move back into the apartments or dwellings where they had lived before. In another, it might be making sure that the children of refugees were able to attend public schools. They basically used the resettlement money as a carrot in order to induce local officials to come down on the pro-peace side of the divide within their own so-called ethnic group, rather than carrying on the conflict by other means now that the shooting had stopped. And importantly, they made sure that some of the benefits from that resettlement assistance flowed to the community as a whole and not only to the returning refugees and displaced persons. So there was a stake for the whole community in adopting a welcoming or open attitude to their erstwhile neighbors. That didn't always happen. Again, that's not the default setting of international assistance. Very often, the default setting is to try to move the money as rapidly as possible and not have any kinds of conditions, especially politically inconvenient ones, that might slow down that process of fulfilling the contracts on time. But in a post-conflict situation, it's important to realize that the goal is not merely to move the money, or for that matter, not merely to rebuild the infrastructure, but also to support the process of building a durable peace. To give you an example of a place where that default setting prevailed, in Mostar, which is one of Bosnia's major cities. I went there shortly after the war, and I felt like I was in Dresden after the Blitz or something. It was just unbelievable, the destruction that had been unleashed. The populations had segregated during the war to save their own lives. And on one side of the river were the Bosnian Croats, and on the other side of the river were the Bosniaks. There was a local administrator, a German man who'd been the mayor of Bremen, Germany, named Hans Kuschnick, who was put in place as the EU-appointed administrator for the city to manage its reconstruction. And one of the top items in terms of infrastructure reconstruction was rebuilding the town's electric grid, electric power system, which had been knocked out during the war. And the power for Mostar came from a hydroelectric dam on the river that flows through the center of the city that now had become the dividing line between the two communities. Kuschnick, to I think his great credit, decided that in rehabilitating the power system, he was going to try to use that again as a vehicle for reconciliation between these two sides who hated and feared each other for good reasons, given what had happened during the war. And that the administration of the power company should include representatives from both sides, and that the power should be distributed to both sides, and that they would have to agree on how to cooperate before the EU would pony up the funds to rehabilitate the hydroelectric plant. It wasn't like you just walk in and say this and everybody says, oh, great. No, no, no. This takes weeks, months, sometimes even years of negotiation before you get an agreement. Before that agreement could be concluded, the World Bank stepped in with its own infrastructure program and decided to rehabilitate the electric power plant under the control of one side only to the conflict without those conditions. That, of course, infuriated the other side, which proceeded to set up its own power plant. And so you ended up with this weird situation where you have what might be described as apartheid in an electricity grid. You had one power plant and grid serving one side, another one serving the other side. That's an example, again, a negative example in the case of Mostar, of the importance of trying to use external resources, which are often the biggest game in town in the wake of a conflict, as a tool for reconciliation and peace building, rather than as an instrument for perpetuating the tensions and conflict. Attention to the impacts of Reconstruction assistance on inequalities, both vertical and horizontal, especially those that were the fault lines of conflict, becomes a really important part of acting responsibly as external assistance actors in such settings. I want to focus in particular on fiscal policy, that is to say, government budgets and distribution. Because part of the rebuilding process is rebuilding a viable government in terms of its fiscal competence, both in raising revenue and in managing expenditure. On the revenue side, a very important issue is trying to restore the ability of the state to mobilize resources to not only assist in reconstruction expenditures, but also, more importantly, to provide goods and services to the population for a long term, thus acquiring legitimacy in the eyes of its people. And those taxes could come from taxes on income, taxes on property like land and real estate, taxes on consumption, and trade taxes or tariffs, which are often an important source of revenue, particularly in low-income countries. There's a need to mobilize this money, and while doing so, to be paying attention to the fundamental distribution question of who's going to pay those taxes, or what economists call the incidence of these various tax instruments. And there's a tension, in particular, with the business as usual prescription of many development assistance agencies, like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which is that countries should try to reduce the role of tariffs, reduce the role of trade taxes in the name of efficiency. On the expenditure side, there's the distributional question of who will receive the benefits funded by state programs, who will receive public goods, public services for basic needs like food, healthcare, housing, for infrastructure like roads, water supplies, electricity, employment, who will get jobs in government-funded programs or in the government itself. And again, there are tensions here with business as usual prescriptions that often concentrate solely on maximizing growth and assume that the benefits will trickle down, a policy sometimes called betting on the strong. In the post-conflict setting, there's a good rationale, a strong rationale, for not necessarily betting on the strong, but indeed trying to make sure that the weak get a fair share of the resources. When it comes to looking at distributional impacts, as I've already suggested, a very important piece of the puzzle is horizontal inequality. Urban versus rural areas, for example, often neglected in the context of discussions of inequality, which tend to focus on race and ethnicity. But in fact, rural-urban tensions are often very important in conflicts. They were important in Bosnia. They were important in Afghanistan. They're important in many places. And ensuring that a fair share of the resources goes to rural areas as opposed to an excessive share being absorbed by urban areas is an important distributional balance question in post-conflict settings. Balances between ethnic and linguistic groups, between the contending parties to the conflict, between regions, between the old and the young, between men and women, all of these distributional balances are part of what needs to be kept in mind in thinking about these questions of how to raise revenue and how to spend money. These are questions that we explored in a project that I managed back in the 2000s called Peace in the Public Purse, which looked at the role of fiscal policy in post-conflict settings and included contributions of case studies from a number of countries, which sheds a lot of light on some of these questions. An example of what came out in that volume was in the chapter in Afghanistan, which was co-authored by Ashraf Ghani, who had been the treasury minister in the Afghan government and then later became president. And in Ghani's chapter, he described his experience in the treasury that obtaining the figures on provincial expenditures, that's expenditures by region, from line ministries. These are the ministries that actually disperse money allocated by the Treasury, so the Ministry of Education or what have you, required months of intense discussion and analysis of manual systems and recordings. In other words, nobody had been routinely collecting that information before. And often that's the case. It's not routinely collected. And when the figures were first presented to the cabinet, it came as a shock that the 10 poorest provinces of the country were receiving the smallest amounts of allocation. Well, that's a shock in terms of what you would hope and perhaps expect, but it's not a shock when we think about the politics of how government resources are often allocated, which kind of follows the maxim, to those who have shall be given, and from those who have not shall be taken away. For building an effective and legitimate state, one of the key elements, and economists and political scientists have long talked about this, particularly political scientists, is what sometimes is described as a fiscal compact or contract between the government and its citizens, a kind of virtuous circle in which the government provides public goods and services that the public wants, and in return for the legitimacy that that creates, the public willingly complies with the state's need for revenue by paying taxes. If you don't have that virtuous circle going on, you instead wind up in a vicious circle where the failure of the government to provide goods and services that the public wants leads to an unwillingness to pay taxes, which in turn reduces the amount of resources available to the government, hence its ability to provide the public goods and services, and so on. In the wake of the Civil War, often the revenue capacity of the state has been severely diminished. It really needs that external assistance in order to begin providing public goods and services to its people. So that external assistance can prime the pump by helping the government provide the services that build legitimacy and build its capacity, not only to manage expenditure, but also to collect revenue. But whether or not external assistance actually performs that pump priming role, helping to crowd in state fiscal capacities, is very much an open question. And all too often, the effect of the influx of external resources is instead to crowd out rather than crowd in state fiscal capacity. Without deliberate and sometimes difficult efforts, there's a substantial risk that the result of the external assistance will be a perverse one in which the state becomes less capable of performing these basic fiscal responsibilities rather than more so.